So the other day, Marco Rubio goes on television and says something that at first glance sounds utterly insane. He says he believes the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. And he doesn't hedge. It's not maybe unconstitutional, not there are concerns, not legal scholars disagree. Just straight out, boom. The law itself may violate the Constitution. And then he adds a little bonus grenade. He says every president has basically believed the same thing. Every president. Now, if you're a normal person with normal hobbies and healthy levels of emotional stability, your immediate reaction is probably something along the lines of, no, wait a minute, isn't the whole point of the War Powers Act to stop presidents from dragging us into wars whenever they feel like it? Yes, that is, in fact, the point, at least theoretically, because according to the Constitution, Congress declares war, allegedly. That's what the document says. But in practice, modern presidents tend to treat Congress less like a co-equal branch of government and more, I don't know, like a Yelp reviewer after the missiles are already in the air. Thank you for your feedback. Explosions have already been shipped. And here's the uncomfortable part. Rubio is not completely making this up. That's what makes this topic fascinating, at least I think. Because once you start pulling on this thread, you realize there's been this quiet constitutional sort of Cold War happening inside our government for decades. Congress passes laws trying to limit presidential war powers. Presidents sign the paperwork, smile for the cameras, and then spend the next 50 years acting like those limits are more of a polite suggestion. And this is not a partisan thing. Republicans do it, Democrats do it, across the board. Presidents who campaigned as anti-war candidates somehow do it too. Every administration inherits these expanded powers from the last guy, stares at them for a few seconds, and then decides, well, I mean, it would be irresponsible not to keep these. And somewhere along the line, America developed this strange system where Congress technically has the power to declare war, but presidents can launch military operations across the globe while Congress holds hearings and issues statements and occasionally discovers they are deeply concerned. Which raises a bigger question than whether Marco Rubio is right. What happens to a democracy when the branch that was supposed to decide on war slowly turns into an audience? So what exactly is the War Powers Act? And why do presidents hate it so much? Hello, neighbors. You are listening to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, a podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. I am Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be discussing the War Powers Act and whether or not it's constitutional. And I'll tell you right off the bat, this is going to be one of the least partisan topics that I've covered on this podcast so far, because this is definitely a both sides issue, and a particularly important one, especially in today's current goings on, but important all the time, and as I think you'll see why as we continue on here. So let me start off with a terminology thing. First of all, you're going to hear people call it the War Powers Act. You'll also hear War Powers Resolution, and it's the same basic thing. The official name is the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And the reason it exists at all is Vietnam. Or more specifically, the realization that America had spent years pouring troops and money and bombs and body bags into a war that Congress never formally declared. Now, think about how wild that is for just a moment. The Constitution very explicitly gives Congress the power to declare war. And that was not an accident. The founders did that on purpose. They were deeply suspicious of concentrated executive power. They didn't want one guy deciding the nation should start shooting at another nation because he woke up feeling patriotic and itchy. And yet, by the time Vietnam rolled around, presidents had figured out that there were ways to operate in this giant constitutional gray area. You didn't necessarily need a formal declaration of war anymore. You just needed a, quote, military action, end quote, or a police action, or a limited engagement, or kinetic military activity, which sounds less like warfare and more like a CrossFit class designed by Lockheed Martin. And Vietnam became the moment where Congress finally looked around and realized, I think we accidentally created an imperial presidency. But here's the thing. Vietnam wasn't just controversial because America lost. It shattered trust in the government. Americans watched presidents steadily escalate the war year after year after year, while officials kept insisting victory was just around the corner. And eventually Congress started realizing they had essentially handed presidents a blank check. So after Vietnam, Congress tried to claw some authority back. And that's where the War Powers Resolution comes in. It passes in 1973. Richard Nixon vetoes it immediately because, of course he does. And then Congress overrides the veto, which is pretty dramatic when you think about it. It doesn't happen all that often. And Congress was basically saying, no, we are reasserting our constitutional role here. We are tired of presidents acting like they can freelance military conflicts whenever they please. Now, the law itself is actually pretty simple, at least in theory. The president can respond quickly in emergencies. Nobody expected presidents to call a full congressional session because enemy planes appeared over the horizon. But the resolution says that once American forces are introduced into hostilities, the president has to notify Congress within 48 hours. Then comes the famous part, the 60-day clock. You've probably heard some of this, talk about this recently. Under the resolution, military involvement is supposed to end within 60 days unless Congress authorizes it. That authorization could come in various ways, through a declaration of war, a specific authorization for military force, or another form of congressional approval. In other words, the idea was the president can react fast, but Congress still decides whether America stays in a particular conflict. Now, that seems reasonable, right? Honestly, I think to most normal people, it probably sounds extremely reasonable. You would think. Yes, obviously, one person should not have unilateral authority to involve the country in prolonged military operations. But almost immediately, presidents from both parties started treating the resolution like that one email from HR that everybody technically acknowledges, but nobody really intends to follow. And this is important. This is not a Republican thing. This is both sides. Democrat presidents have done this too. Republican presidents have done it. Cold War presidents, war on terror presidents, presidents who campaigned as reluctant to start wars, presidents who campaigned as aggressive war hawks. Over and over again, administrations have filed reports that are carefully worded to avoid admitting that the law is binding. That is not an accident. They'll often say military actions are, quote, consistent with, end quote, the resolution. Now, notice what they're not saying. They don't say, we are acting under the constitutional authority of the War Powers Resolution. Because presidents have spent decades quietly signaling, yeah, we'll cooperate with parts of this thing when it's convenient, but we don't necessarily agree that Congress can limit commander-in-chief authority this way. And once you realize that piece, the entire debate changes, because it stops being a simple argument over one law. Now you're talking about a much bigger constitutional fight. Who actually controls war-making authority in modern America? Congress, the president, both, neither? Because if every president believes these limits are at least partially unconstitutional, then maybe the real story here is actually that the constitutional balance itself has been drifting for decades. And presidents have spent the last half century chewing through that leash. All right, so the constitutional argument. Because if you hear somebody say the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional, it might sound ridiculous on its face. You think, wait, there was a law designed to limit presidential war power and it's unconstitutional? That feels backwards. It's like saying speed limits violate the constitutional rights of NASCAR drivers. But here's where things get more complicated. And to be fair about this, the argument against the War Powers Resolution is not some fringe theory, that it was invented on Reddit by a guy named Liberty Eagle 1776, some outlying thing that people debate in corners that's now being drudged up. Serious constitutional scholars have debated this for decades. Presidents from both parties have raised concerns about it. And the core argument basically comes down to this. The Constitution splits military authority between Congress and the president, but it never draws a nice, clean line between the two. Congress has the power to declare war. The president is commander-in-chief. Okay, sounds straightforward until you ask the obvious question. What exactly counts as war? Because modern military conflict does not look anything like 1776 anymore. Nobody formally lines up in redcoats and marches into battle with drummers, pounding on their drums and guys carrying flags and so on and so on. Modern conflicts can happen incredibly fast. Missile strikes, drone operations, special forces ops, cyber attacks, terror threats, regional escalations. Presidents argue that foreign policy and military response often move far too quickly for Congress to react in real time. And honestly, that part is 100% true. Congress is not exactly famous for rapid efficiency, especially in today's atmosphere where everything is a partisan debate. Everything is framed and rhetoric is piled on before any business is actually gotten to. This is a body that can spend 6 months arguing over whether the post office should stay open on Saturdays. So defenders of broad presidential power say the Constitution intentionally created an energetic executive branch capable of being decisive, especially in a crisis. And that's what you'll hear a lot. Energetic executive, which sounds, less like constitutional law and more like, an energy drink. But the basic idea is this. The president cannot effectively function as commander-in-chief if Congress can micromanage every military decision in real time. That's argument number one. And then there's the second argument, and this one is probably the biggest constitutional issue at the heart of this whole thing. Critics of the War Powers Resolution argue that Congress cannot limit powers that the Constitution itself grants directly to the president. In other words, if commander-in-chief authority comes from the Constitution itself, Congress can't just pass a regular law shrinking those powers. So think of it this way. Congress cannot pass a law saying the president may no longer pardon people. Right? If they tried to do that, if they wanted to change the pardon process and say the president can't do it anymore, they can't. Why? Because the pardon power comes directly from the Constitution. So critics of the resolution argue the same logic applies here. If a president possesses independent military authority under Article 2, Congress then cannot simply legislate portions of that authority away. Now, whether you agree with that is a different question, but constitutionally speaking, that is the argument. Then comes the 60-day provision. This is where things get really messy. Remember that the resolution says presidents generally have 60 days to continue military involvement unless Congress authorizes it. Now, that sounds reasonable, but opponents argue that once troops are deployed and military operations are underway, Congress forcing withdrawal may interfere with the president's ability to command military operations in any effective way. In that view, Congress is no longer simply deciding whether to declare war. It's potentially interfering with battlefield decisions and operations that have already begun. And as you would expect, presidents absolutely hate that idea. Because from the perspective of the executive branch, war doesn't operate on a congressional calendar. Military situations evolve with lightning speed. Threats change. Alliances shift. Intelligence comes in that changes things. And administrations argue the president needs flexibility to respond to events that unfold without Congress standing over their shoulder and holding a stopwatch. Then there's another constitutional wrinkle most people probably have never heard of, the legislative veto. Originally, the War Powers Resolution allowed Congress to end military involvement through something called a concurrent resolution, meaning Congress could basically vote to stop military action without the president signing off on it. But in 1983, the Supreme Court decided a case called INS v. Chadha and ruled that this kind of legislative veto mechanism was unconstitutional. That decision weakened a good part of the legal framework that is underlying in that War Powers Resolution. So over time, pieces of the law became shakier. Now, at this point, you might be listening to all this and thinking, okay, so does that mean presidents can just attack whoever they want, whenever they want? No, not exactly. Even scholars who criticize the War Powers Resolution usually acknowledge Congress still has enormous constitutional power over war and the military. Congress controls funding. Congress authorizes military operations. Congress oversees the armed forces. Congress can investigate administrations. Congress can theoretically impeach presidents who abuse power. The problem isn't that Congress lacks authority. The problem is that Congress often seems weirdly reluctant to use it. That part gets lost a lot of the time because the Constitution debate isn't really, can Congress restrain war making? Almost everyone agrees Congress has enormous war-related powers. The debate is now narrower and more complicated. The real argument comes down to, can Congress restrain presidential war powers this way? Can they impose these specific kinds of limits on the commander-in-chief's authority through ordinary legislation, i.e. the War Powers Resolution? Once you wrap your head around that distinction, then Rubio's comments start making more sense. Not necessarily more comforting, but at least a little bit more understandable. because presidents of both parties have spent years and years quietly operating under the belief that parts of the War Powers Resolution cross constitutional lines. Which brings us to the other side of this argument. And honestly, this is a side that the founders themselves probably would have obsessed over. The founders of this country were absolutely terrified of concentrated executive power. And that makes sense when you remember who they had just finished fighting. They just finished fighting the King of England. That's the whole backdrop of the Constitution. The American Revolution was not just about taxes or tea or, George Washington crossing rivers. It was fundamentally about rejecting the idea that one person should hold too much unchecked authority, especially when it came to war. Because historically, kings loved war. War expanded power. It rallied nationalism. It was great for silencing dissent. It justified other emergency measures. And perhaps most importantly, kings could start wars much faster than any representative governments could. And that scared the founders a lot. Which is why the Constitution very deliberately splits military authority between Congress and the president. Congress declares war. The president commands the military once war exists. That division was intentional. The founders didn't want a president waking up one morning feeling, threatened or ambitious or pissed off and dragging the nation into conflict by himself. James Madison warned about this constantly. He believed the executive branch was the part of government, quote, most interested in war and most prone to it, end quote. And honestly, that's one of those quotes from history that feels less like an old political theory and more like somebody accidentally invented, Twitter 200 years early. Because think about the incentives. Presidents are associated with strength, action, national security, command. There is enormous political pressure on presidents to look decisive during international crises. Congress, meanwhile, is slower and messier and more argumentative by design, which was exactly the point. The founders intentionally designed Congress to move slowly before committing the nation to war. That was not a bug in the system. That wasn't an accidental outcome. That was the system. They wanted debate and delay and public accountability. They wanted multiple people involved in the decision because they understood something honestly deeply uncomfortable about human nature. It's much easier to start wars than to end them. And once people start dying, then momentum takes over. And, things like national pride and fear and political ego, nobody wants to admit failure halfway through a conflict. So the founders tried to build friction into the process. But over time, modern warfare started eroding that framework. Technology changed. Global politics changed. America became a superpower with military bases scattered across the planet, and presidents increasingly argued they needed flexibility to respond quickly to threats. And often that was legitimate. Sometimes less legitimate. And here's where the conversation gets even more uncomfortable, because if you step back and look at modern American history, look at it honestly, Congress has slowly drifted from being the branch that decides on war to the branch that reacts to war after the fact. That's a huge shift. Presidents launch strikes. Congress issues statements. Presidents deploy forces. Congress schedules hearings 3 weeks later where senators ask sternly worded questions, and they most often already know no one is going to answer them directly. Congress now reacts to military action the way normal people react to severe weather alerts. We are monitoring the situation closely. Fantastic. Thank you. Very reassuring. And the danger the founders feared starts creeping back into view. Not kings exactly, although, it's fluid. Things are definitely not as not king as they used to be. But either way, concentrated executive authority justified by permanent crisis. Let's put it that way. Because that's the thing about modern geopolitics. There's always a crisis. Always. A terror threat, some hostile regime, a regional conflict, a militia, some emerging danger, a humanitarian emergency, strategic necessities. There's always another reason why normal procedures supposedly need to bend. And over time, emergency powers stopped feeling temporary. They started becoming the operating system. That's what makes this debate bigger than one law from 1973. This is really a conversation about whether America has quietly normalized a presidency far more powerful than the founders ever intended. Because if one person can launch military operations around the globe whenever they determine circumstances make it necessary, Congress slowly becomes less a decision maker and more an observer. And once that happens, now the constitutional balance the founders designed starts looking less like a functioning system and more like, like a historical artifact. Something that we reference ceremonially or in civics class, while the actual machinery of power operates in a different place entirely. And to be fair, this drift isn't a recent thing. It didn't happen overnight. Presidents they didn't just suddenly seize total war authority in one dramatic moment while, bald eagles screamed in the background. It happened gradually, as so many things do. One conflict at a time, one emergency at a time, one justification at a time. And every president inherited the expanded powers of the last one. Each time a new president came in, the places where the last one pushed the envelope a little bit now were inherited by the new president. And then the new president found reasons not to give those things back. The pattern really starts becoming obvious once you look at the last, 70, 80 years of American history, because the expansion of presidential powers or presidential war powers did not happen in one constitutional explosion. It was more along the lines of coastal erosion, slowly, gradually, one crisis at a time until people barely noticed the shoreline had moved. Take Korea. The Korean War begins in 1950 under President Harry S. Truman. And Truman never asks Congress for a declaration of war. He never gets one. Instead, the administration frames it as a police action connected to the United Nations. Now, think about how important that particular moment is, because before that, formal declarations of war were still generally understood as the constitutional norm. World War II had declarations. World War I had declarations. But Korea starts shifting the culture. Presidents begin realizing they can engage in major conflicts without technically calling them wars. And Congress mostly goes along with it. Then comes Vietnam. And Vietnam is where the whole issue explodes into public consciousness, because Vietnam becomes the nightmare scenario that the founders feared. Incremental escalation, vague objectives, unclear timelines, casualties mounting day by day, and no formal declaration of war. Instead, Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, which gives President Lyndon Johnson broad authority to respond militarily in Southeast Asia after reported attacks involving U.S. naval vessels. And over time, that authorization basically becomes like a giant expandable permission slip. Troops increase, bombing campaigns expand, the war deepens, and Congress gradually starts to realize they handed the executive branch an enormous amount of discretionary power and put in very few meaningful limits, which is why, after Vietnam, then you end up with the War Powers Resolution. It's Congress essentially saying, okay, we need guardrails here. We can't keep doing this the way we've been doing it. But then comes the next phase of the story, because even after the resolution passes, presidents continue stretching executive military authority further and further and further. Sometimes openly, sometimes through legal ambiguity, or sometimes because Congress lacks the political, will to stop them. So fast forward to after 9/11. This is probably the single biggest accelerator of the presidential war powers since the resolution, certainly in recent years. The attacks happen. The country is traumatized, terrified, angry, and Congress passes the Authorization for Use of Military Force, the AUMF. Now, at the time, it seemed straightforward. Go after the people responsible for 9/11. Made total sense. But over the years, that authorization becomes astonishingly broad. Successive administrations use it to justify military operations in multiple countries against multiple groups, many of which didn't even exist on September 11th, 2001. And this is where you really start to see how emergency powers evolve. Because once broad authority exists, future presidents inherit it, then they reinterpret it, and then they expand it. And very few presidents willingly surrender power once they have it. And that's true regardless of party. President George W. Bush dramatically expanded executive military authority after 9/11. Then President Obama inherits those powers and expands aspects of them further through drone warfare and counter-terror operations. And this is important to acknowledge, honestly, because people tend to develop this selective constitutional concerns depending on who happens to be in the White House. Obama campaigned against aspects of the Bush-era approach to executive power, but once in office, his administration conducted extensive drone strike operations across multiple countries, including operations targeting American citizens under certain circumstances. That raised enormous constitutional questions, not just about war powers, but due process itself. Then comes Libya in 2011. This is a huge war powers moment that a lot of people barely remember now. The Obama administration participates in military operations in Libya beyond the 60-day limit outlined in the War Powers Resolution. Now, critics jump up and say that this clearly violates the law. The administration responds with an argument that, honestly, it almost feels almost parody level lawyerly, if that phrase makes sense. Basically, what they say is these operations do not constitute hostilities in the constitutional sense contemplated by the resolution. It's one of those Washington-type sentences that sounds like it was generated by, feeding caffeine directly into a legal textbook. People hear missiles exploding and think, what exactly is your definition of hostilities? But that moment matters because it demonstrates something crucial. Presidents increasingly interpret their war powers through the executive branch legal theories rather than through Congress. The executive branch starts acting as both participant and referee. Then comes President Trump. He enters office and pushes executive authority aggressively in many areas, including military operations. The 2020 strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani reignites the war powers debate instantly. Congress erupts. Questions fly about authorization, escalation, constitutional authority. And once again, America finds itself asking the same question as it's been asking for decades. How much unilateral military authority does the president actually have? Now, then Joe Biden takes office. And I'm assuming you can guess what happens. The underlying structure largely remains. Counter-terror operations continue and airstrikes continue. Executive military authority continues operating within this broad post-9/11 framework. Because by now, these powers are deeply embedded into the modern presidency itself. And here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Congress often seems strangely okay with this arrangement. Not necessarily publicly, of course. Publicly, members of Congress love giving speeches about constitutional balance and oversight. But institutionally, there are incentives here. If presidents take the lead on military action, Congress gets political flexibility. If things go well, lawmakers praise strength and leadership. If things go badly, then they criticize the president. Either way, many members avoid having to cast any politically dangerous votes themselves. And slowly, over decades, America drifts into this strange constitutional reality where Congress technically possesses enormous war powers while presidents increasingly exercise them in practice. Not because one president seized dictatorship powers, but because each administration inherited expanded authority from the last one, normalized it a little further, and handed it off to the next occupant of the Oval Office. Like a constitutional snowball rolling downhill and getting larger, every election cycle. And that brings us to the real question underneath all of this. Not, is Marco Rubio technically correct? And not, can legal scholars construct constitutional arguments against the War Powers Resolution? Yes, on both cases. They clearly can. The bigger question, I think, is this. If every modern president believes at least some limits on war-making authority are unconstitutional, then what exactly is stopping the presidency from absorbing more and more military power as time goes by? Because if we're being honest, the system the founders envisioned already looks very different from the system that we actually operate under. Congress still technically has the authority to declare war. That power exists on paper, but in practice, America has engaged in military operations across multiple countries for decades with no formal declarations. At some point, you have to stop pretending that's an occasional exception and acknowledge that it is the norm. And once something becomes the norm politically, it starts becoming normalized psychologically too. People stop reacting to it. Think about how strange modern headlines would sound to earlier generations of Americans. President authorizes airstrikes overnight. The administration conducted operations in Region X. Additional troops deployed. Most people barely blink at headlines like that these days. And that's certainly not because people have become evil or bloodthirsty. It's because permanent military engagement has become sort of background noise for modern Americans. And when something just becomes background noise, accountability gets fuzzy. Now, to be fair, Congress is not powerless here, not even close. As I said, Congress could reassert itself if it truly wanted to. They control the military funding. They could repeal or replace old authorizations for military force. They could refuse appropriations. They could pass clearer laws. Congress could force difficult constitutional confrontations. But doing those things requires political courage. And political courage has gotten very scarce in Washington, especially where national security is in the conversation. Because nobody wants to be blamed for appearing weak. Nobody wants the campaign ad coming out against them that accuses them of undermining the troops or endangering America. So inertia takes over. Presidents keep doing what they're doing, and Congress keeps reacting. Courts usually avoid stepping too deeply into these disputes because judges tend to treat war powers and the arguments as political questions, better resolved by the elected branches. And so the cycle continues. One administration stretches authority, the next administration inherits the stretch point as the new baseline and expands it from there. And, this is where the conversation stops being just narrowly legal and starts becoming philosophical. What kind of democracy gradually becomes comfortable concentrating military authority in one person? Even if that concentration happens slowly, even if it happens through precedent instead of dramatic, constitutional collapse. Even if presidents genuinely believe they are acting in the national interest. Because the founders understood something timeless about power. It rarely announces itself by kicking the door down dramatically. It expands incrementally, most often. Pragmatically, conveniently, always for, quote, good reasons, end quote. And always because circumstances are exceptional. Always because this particular emergency is supposedly just cannot wait. And after enough emergencies, temporary power starts hardening into something more permanent. That's the tension sitting underneath this entire debate. Not whether presidents need flexibility sometimes. They certainly do. Not whether Congress can move slowly. Oh, they certainly do. The tension is whether America still meaningfully believes war-making decisions should require broad democratic accountability, or whether we have quietly just accepted that modern presidents simply operate with vast unilateral military discretion. Because if Congress no longer meaningfully decides on war, and courts hesitate to intervene, and presidents themselves believe that a lot of these restrictions are bogus, then eventually the restraints become less legal than cultural. Things like norms and traditions and political pressure and public opinion. And history is filled with examples showing how fragile those things can become, especially when you introduce words like fear or crisis or nationalism into the conversation. Maybe that's the real warning buried inside this whole debate. Not that America suddenly became authoritarian overnight, but that democracies can slowly normalize concentrated power while convincing themselves the Constitution is still functioning exactly as it was written. Maybe the strangest part of this entire conversation is that both sides are arguing from concerns that are, at least on some level, legitimate. Because here's the thing, you probably do not want a president having to wait 3 weeks for Congress to finish arguing before responding to an actual attack. If missiles are inbound, if troops are under attack, if there's an immediate threat, most people understand instinctively that a president needs the ability to act quickly. It's part of the job. And honestly, the founders understood that too. They did not design the presidency to be powerless. The Constitution absolutely gives the executive branch significant military authority. The disagreement has always been about where emergency response ends and unilateral war-making begins. And that line gets blurrier and blurrier with each passing year. Especially because modern conflict itself is so blurry now. There's no clean moment where somebody walks into Congress and says, "Good afternoon, everyone. We are now officially at war." Now it's cyber operations and counter-terror strikes and proxy conflicts and special forces missions, intelligence operations, drone campaigns, targeted eliminations, temporary deployments that somehow last 15 years. The language changes constantly, but the underlying question stays the same. Who decides when America uses military force? And maybe that's why the war powers debate never goes away. Because underneath all of the legal crap and constitutional theories is something more basic. Trust. How much power should one person have during moments of fear and crisis? That's really the question. And the founders were deeply skeptical of concentrated power during fearful moments because fearful populations tend to accept authority more easily. History shows that over and over and over. During crises, people want decisiveness and strength and action. The slow messiness of democracy starts feeling frustrating when there's danger in the picture or perceived danger. That's when executives historically gain power most rapidly. And to be clear, again, it's not unique to Donald Trump or Obama or Bush or Biden. This pattern stretches across modern history. Presidents inherit emergency powers. Presidents justify keeping those emergency powers. And then future presidents inherit those expanded powers. And every administration believes it will use those powers responsibly. That's always the assumption. The problem is that constitutional systems are not designed around trusting individual leaders forever. They're designed around limiting what any one leader can do, regardless of the intentions. That's the entire philosophy underneath checks and balances. Not we found perfect humans, but humans with power require limits. And honestly, maybe that's the most unsettling realization here. The debate over war powers is not really about one statute from the 1970s. It's about whether the constitutional balance that the founding fathers envisioned can realistically survive the realities of modern global superpower politics. Because America today is not the America of 1787. The military is larger, the world is faster, threats move quicker. There's, technology changed everything. But human nature didn't change. Ambition didn't change. And fear didn't change. The temptation to consolidate authority during dangerous moments definitely did not change. Which means the core constitutional tension the founders worried about is still alive. Maybe more so now than ever. And maybe the scariest part isn't that presidents think the war powers resolution is unconstitutional. Maybe it's that almost nobody in Washington seems particularly interested in forcing a final answer to the question. The ambiguity benefits everybody who has power. Presidents get flexibility, Congress avoids accountability, the courts avoid political landmines, and the public gets used to military actions that, happen somewhere in the background while, The Bachelor still airs and, they can still scroll Instagram. Until someday you wake up and realize the Constitution still technically says Congress declares war. But somewhere along the line, that started feeling less like an actual rule and more like nostalgia. All right, everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I'm so glad you did, and I want to hear from you. Tell me what your thoughts are on all of this. Do you think that it's unrealistic to have a congressional debate when there's military operations to be done, or do you think that the president these days has far too much power? Let me know. Go to the website, neighborontheLeft.com, and go to the contacts page. You can use any one of the social media links to send a direct message, or you can use the email address that's there. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on anything, the podcast itself, comments, critiques, suggestions, whatever. While you're on the website, you can also check out the episodes section. There's a web player where you can listen to or download any of the episodes going all the way back to the first one. And if you're interested in what sources I use for my information, go to the blog section. The posts there mirror the things I talk about in the podcast, and at the end of each is all of the sources that I use. I think that's really important these days. I'll be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.